For you to understand how the muscle functional unit works, it is absolutely necessary for you to understand the proteins that are involved. So I've been mentioning about actinin, which holds the actin molecules. I'm looking at the middle diagram here. So we have the actinin molecule that holds them together, and that is what forms the Z line. We have the titin, which is highly coiled, but as you can see, it coils and then it goes into the middle of a thick filament. And the thick filament is the one which is forming the heat band. So now, my main focus and my main interest is this part. We have the thin filament. I had already discussed the detailed structure of the thick filament. So now I want to discuss the detailed structure of the thin filament. We have several proteins involved. Troponin, we have tropomyosin. If you remember, I said those are regulatory proteins and I told you how they interact. Then we have actin itself, and the actin forms this kind of structure, helical structure. Then we are going to see nebulin. Nebulin holds the two together. So what I will do is, before I discuss this structure, I will look at the individual structure of troponin, the individual structure of tropomyosin, and that one of actin. To do this, I will go to a different slide. This slide. I love this slide because it splits all these proteins separately. We have, I said, the first protein we will address is troponin. Troponin has three different portions. One portion binds to actin, the other portion binds to tropomyosin, and the other portion binds to calcium. So we have what we call troponin C, which binds to calcium, then troponin A, which binds to actin, and we have the troponin I, which binds to tropomyosin. So we have three different types of troponin IAC. One binds to tropomyosin, the other binds to actin, and the other one binds to calcium. So like I said, the ones that bind to actin and tropomyosin, they're the ones which determine in which position the tropomyosin will stay. If it binds calcium, the whole of this troponin shifts direction. You can see in this one, the C binding, which is this portion, is facing that direction. Upon binding of calcium, it twists and faces the other direction. So what is the implication of this? When it is facing that direction, it covers the actin molecule, and the region at which it covers the actin molecule is these white portions, and the white portions represent the myosin binding sites. So as long as the white portion is covered, myosin cannot bind. When calcium comes and attaches, it shifts the troponin molecule into one direction, causing the tropomyosin to be moved. And when the tropomyosin is moved, the portion is exposed, and this molecule, which is the myosin head, can now bind. Okay? So you see that is a cycle. Calcium, remember the calcium is represented by the yellow. Calcium binds the troponin C. Troponin C will shift the whole of the troponin molecule, thereby pulling, this is the tropomyosin apart, And when it pulls the tropomyosin apart, it exposes the myosin binding site. So now we have learned about troponin. It has 3 chains, A, C, and I. Now, the next protein we look at is tropomyosin. We say that when the protein is formed, it is formed by one amino acid linking to another amino acid, linking to another amino acid, forming a long chain. Some of these chains do not really fold into a ball, so that even their tertiary structure is really a filamentous protein. For that reason, it is a filament of fiber. So tropomyosin is one of those proteins which do not form a ball. Instead, you find that the tropomyosin will interact with actin by twisting around the actin molecule. So that is tropomyosin. Now, when we come to troponin, this is, sorry, not troponin, actin. This is the actin chain. Actin is actually a globular protein. So after forming that long chain, it will fold itself and form a structure that is globular. This actin will interact with another one that is globular, which will interact with another one that is globular, so that it will end up forming a very long chain, but of globular molecules. Now, the two are still called actin. However, we have that actin that forms a globular structure, and we call this the G-actin. So we have G-actin. It is globular. G-actin will interact with other G-actins to form a filamentous protein. And that filamentous protein is a chain, is a filament, which is known as the F. F for filament, F-actin. A common question I give, and I told you to note questions. Distinguish between F and G-actin. So, if I were to ask you that, Wendy Wanda, what would be your answer? Wendy, are you in class? Okay, high time I start taking attendance. Wendy, are you in class? So if I call out your name and you're not in class, I will mark you absent, and that will carry out for the day. Wendy, are you in class?
Yes, written in the group chat.
Okay. Let me see what she has written. I need the answer. Don't tell me I cannot, my microphone is not working. That's a very long sentence. Yes, my mic has issues. That's a long sentence that you could have written the difference between F and G. Can you give me the difference? Type so that I know you are in class. Wendy, if you are not typing that answer, I will mark you absent because you just had your name called out and you showed up. So I need the answer to convince me you are in class. F versus G actin. just the difference. So Wendy, you are ready to take the absent, eh? Wendy, I need to be convinced you are in class. Are you going to type or not? G is globular. Thank you. So, Patalia, Priska, you've done quite a number of answers. So let's hear Patalia. What's the other answer? So Wendy has said it is globular.
I would say G would be soluble.
Oh, okay. I had not mentioned that. Thank you. Karishma, okay, it is globular, most likely it is soluble. But what
Ma'am, I had a question also.
Yes.
Could we say that the F actin forms a helix, a double helix?
We'll go to that.
Okay.
We'll go to that. Be patient. So when Wanda, I'm impressed, both of them, the answers are correct. G is globular, F is fibrous. That is what I wanted to hear because that's what I had just said in class. So those are the things that you read. It is extra reading, which is good. But what I wanted to do is be convinced that people are listening. Eh? So now, one is globular, the other one is fibrous, for the purpose of the structure of the protein and how it works. Now, Karishma has brought this component. It's a double helix, which is true. So we'll find that for every fiber, for every thin filament, we are going to have a double helix of this structure. And I will try to imagine that this is a globular fiber, and what it will do, it will go and intertwine with this structure like that, forming a double helix similar to what we see in the DNA molecule. Now, if you have two strands, if I have a strand A and another strand B, and I put them parallel, and then I tie them at one end, and then I start twisting the two of them together, they will form a double helix like this. Now, between these two molecules, so that I don't have them falling apart, I might have another protein here that will interact with these two proteins, so that when I twist them, they will twist like around this second protein in the middle. So when I start twisting, you'll find that this rope does not move, but these ones will twist around the middle one. So the one they twist around is usually what we call nebulin. It holds the two helices together. Okay, nebulin. Now, imagine on one end, we had another protein. Oh, I can't do that. So imagine I had another protein here on this end and another protein here on this end. So now I twist this whole component. You find that this is the structure you get. We have the two double helices, this one. So I have my double helix of actin, this being one chain here. So that is one chain. So what I have drawn here is one chain of actin molecule. I will draw the second chain so that you see where it is. Can you see from here? This is the second chain. And you can see they are forming a double helix. Right in the middle where you cannot see, between these double helices is a nebulin. And the nebulin holds them straight at an angle so that they don't fall apart. So you can assume a nebulin is right in the middle of the two helices where you cannot see, but at every place where they twist, you find that they are twisting around the nebulin. So let me remove the nebulin, and you see on one end, I have now the blue. The blue is twisting, one blue is twisting around one of the structures. The other blue is twisting around the second structure. So we have one blue here. So we have one blue line, this one, twisting around one of the actin molecules here. And the other blue line is on the other side. So the whole of these are twisting around the red one. So they go around it. And this is to ensure that this one all occurs in a straight line. So they're just going round this straight line. Now, for that reason, you find that these structures are repeated. Whatever I have on this side is repeated by this other chain. At this point, I see one hand up. Cynthia, let me hear what you have to ask. Unmute yourself, please. Cynthia, your hand is up. Unmute yourself and ask your question. Robbie. Robbie, where are you?
Yes, sorry, it was a mistake.
If it's a mistake, then you tell us, because I'm waiting for the question. You just say sorry and lower your hand. Okay, so any questions so far? So far we have discussed three main proteins. We have the myosin, actin. Actin is globular and filamentous, and then we have tropomyosin. Those are the main proteins. Now for the mechanism of contraction, you see that we also need ATP, calcium, and magnesium. We are going to see what they do later. So I was at that point. So now that we have seen, was I there? No. I was at this point. So now you can see with the idea that I have given you, we do have several proteins, and sorry, I can see that even the tropomyosin forms a double helix on its own. So tropomyosin has its own double helix, and then it twists around the double helix of the actin. And you can see the organization of the troponin, which has an actin binding site here and a myosin binding site, but it also has a site for holding the calcium. In this diagram, you can see where the nebulin is. You can see it's a straight line for nebulin, and it is around the nebulin that all these proteins twist around. Now, with this in mind, and remember the structure of the myosin. So the myosin will come from one end, and then it will hinge, and it will have a knob. And this knob can bind to the myosin binding site. But then it is covered, so it can't bind. It is only when the tropomyosin moves away that you uncover the binding site, and then myosin can bind. So I think we've already looked at that structure. We've already discussed the size of the sarcomere. So it is also important to note that when myosin interact with actin, then we say the fiber is contracting. However, in most cases, the contraction might result in decrease in sarcomere size. That is what we have described. In other cases, it might interact, but the sarcomere will not shorten. When that happens, what will happen is you increase tension. When you increase tension, it means the length of the fiber is not changing. So in this sentence, it says, contractions do not always shorten the muscle fiber. We can have a type of contraction where the length is the same. Same length is termed as isometric. Same length, but it is contracting. So what is happening? It means the myosins are interacting with the actin, creating a lot of tension. A good example is when you are holding something like a cup. If I told you to stretch out your hand and you hold a container, okay? If you hold a container here, and what I do, this container may be very big. So your fingers are here. You hold a container, and you can see the angle of your hand. This is your upper hand, this is your lower hand, and these are the fingers. So now I start to add some fluid here. When I start to add fluid, it starts to fill. And when it starts to fill, this container becomes heavy. But you are still holding the cup, you are not allowing it to drop, and you are not even lifting it further. But because the weight is changing, what you are doing is you are increasing the interaction of myosin and actin heads so that you create tension, and that tension will be able to support the hand there where it is. So I might fill this container with 1 liter of fluid, and it will recruit a number of fibers. Then I add 2 liters, and you find that it will recruit more fibers. It is contracting, but the hand is not changing in length, but it is able to support even 3 liters. So if you look at the interaction of the muscles, when this hand is supporting an empty cup versus when it is supporting 3 liters of fluid, there will be a greater interaction of the muscles because you'll have recruited more fibers so that you can support the weight. So what you'll have created is tension. In that case, we talk of isometric contraction. On the other hand, if I were to tell you to contract this muscle and forget about maintaining the same position. So I'm holding a cup. It may be empty, it may have some fluids. But then I tell you, I want you to bend your hand. And what you're going to do is you're slowly going to start recruiting fibers so that the arm comes forward. And as it comes forward, the muscle is shortening. So what you're doing is the tone, the tension. You are maintaining the same tension because you are moving the fiber. You are moving the sarcomere, making sure that the tension remains the same. That kind of contraction will change the muscle length. But because the tension remains the same, it is known as isotonic. Isotonic results in shortening of muscle. Okay, so we have those two types of contraction. It can be isometric or it can be isotonic. When you go to the gym, it will come to another type of contraction known as isokinetic. Isokinetic will comprise of both changing length, changing tone, using the same amount of energy. That's why it is called isokinetic. And we'll see how that one happens later, not now. Any question on contraction? Okay. So I think we've gone through this slide and we have seen how a sarcomere shortens so that it results in movement or change in length of the muscle. On the other hand, where we do not have change in length, it simply means we have more and more interaction between the actin and the myosin, therefore creating a very high tension, which means even if I were to place something on that muscle, because of the tension that is there, that muscle is very taut, very, very tight. And a good example, I'm sure you've all done this, you've told yourselves to fold your biceps without moving the hand. You contract and you see a bulge of the triceps. When you see that bulge, you try to press against the bulge, you feel that it is very tense because you are creating tension, although you are not moving the muscle. So this diagram shows you an interaction between myosin heads and the actin molecule. So when you allow contraction to occur, when you remove the tropomyosin from the myosin binding site on the actin filament, immediately the myosin will attach. When it attaches, we say that it forms a cross bridge. So we start saying now it is forming cross bridges. Each and every connection here is a cross bridge. It's a bridge between the myosin and the actin. So the cross bridge is usually formed by the myosin heads, and it forms when they bind on the myosin binding site on the actin. Okay, so I don't know whether I need to elaborate this diagram any further. It is just obtained from a different book representing the same information I gave you. G-actin interacting to form the F-actin. You can see the F-actin strands here, which are forming a double helix chain. Troponin with the three components, myosin, actin binding site, troponin A that interacts with the actin, troponin C that interacts with calcium, and the troponin I that interacts with the tropomyosin. Again, here is the heavy chain forming a hinge, forming the two knobs. So I think that diagram is self-explanatory. I can move to the next one. Yes, Patoki. I always combine Patoki and Taiwo. That's why I call you that name. But it's just
Yes, ma'am. I want to ask, does this actin and myosin interaction in any way affect axonoplasmic transport?
axonoplasmic transport is formed usually by, we have, what are they called? Microtubules. So you'll find within the myofibrils, you cannot have microtubules. But these microtubules form the cytoskeleton. Cytoskeleton will be away from these myofibrils. So if I were to remind you, we have one, the myofiber, and the myofiber has myofibrils, and the myofibrils are the ones which have the myosin and actin. So in between, we still have cytoplasm. And connecting even to the plasma membrane, we have the cytoskeleton. Cytoskeleton is the one that will comprise the microtubules. And that is where we start seeing the axoplasmic transport, not on the myosin, not on these myofibrils. Is that okay?
Yes, ma'am. Thank you.
Welcome. So now, this is where we are going to go through the mechanism of contraction. I told you it is very important for you to understand the structure so that you can understand mechanism of contraction. So here is our myosin. I told you myosin has the myosin heads shooting out of the heavy chains. And when they shoot out of the heavy chains, they go in all directions. There are those that face down. There are those heads that face up. There are those that face sideways. Okay? And around each of these myosin, we have the actin filament. In this case, they've only shown one actin filament. And this actin filament is in association with a myosin filament above it and a myosin filament below it. Now you can see the heads from the one above. The myosin head or knobs are pointing downwards. The one above, the myosin heads are pointing upwards. Now in this position, the myosin heads are highly activated. They are very, 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 very active in that they just want to bind actin. They are acting like magnets. And when you bring magnets close to metal, it just wants to attach. These heads, as they are activated myosin heads. How can you tell they are activated? Because they are not binding actin. And secondly, they have a hydrolyzed ATP. ATP is broken down to give ADP plus inorganic phosphates. This process of breaking down ATP provides a lot of energy. But this energy is now trapped by the myosin head. It has not gone anywhere. So now we have a hydrolyzed ATP, which has been broken into two molecules, one ADP and the other one inorganic phosphate, and it has trapped a lot of energy in the head. Now this energy is forcing the myosin head to just want to bind to actin. But as it comes to the actin, the active site is covered by tropomyosin. So what happens first? Calcium must bind troponin so that the troponin will twist away the tropomyosin and expose the myosin binding site on the actin. So if you look at this globular protein, which is actin, the pink portion represents the part that cannot bind myosin. The lighter tannish or yellowish portion is the active site that can bind myosin.
Not to interrupt your lecture.
Yes?
Some of us had class at 11. I don't want to interrupt your lecture, but
Which
some of us
class?
had class at 11. Biochemistry.
Victor,
Yes.
welcome to my world. Do you read the WhatsApp messages?
Occasionally.
Occasionally. You should read all the time. Can somebody help Victor out?
There's no biochemistry class.
There is no biochemistry. Victor, you came in late. I told you that I'm making up for the double biochemistry you had last week. So today I'm having the double, but I will not overload you. So by 12, I hope that I'll release you. Okay. Thank you, Victor, but continue paying attention. So now, to take you back, calcium has bound troponin. Troponin has pulled away the tropomyosin. The tropomyosin has uncovered the yellow parts, which are the active myosin binding sites. And remember, we also have a very energized myosin head. So immediately calcium binds myosin will bind that tissue. So that is the next step. On the other side, we also have a myosin knob here. And this myosin will also attach to that portion. And similarly, all the myosin heads that are popping upwards, interacting with this particular actin filament, they will attach. The ones on this other side, they will attach the actin filament that will be here. And the other ones will attach. So all the actin filaments will be interacting with the different myosin heads. Now, after binding, it doesn't stay there. The next step is you find, now this is the next step that we have bound, but it does not stop there. Remember that energy. That binding will cause the release of the inorganic phosphates. Just initially when it attaches, causes the release of inorganic phosphates. And then the next thing that will happen is the myosin head will bend. And that bending is what we call a power stroke. The point of removing inorganic phosphate will cause a power stroke, and the power stroke will cause the release of ADP. So step by step, this is where I'm going to start calling people to repeat the mechanism. So I want all of you to pay attention, including Yosif, who is the last person on my participant list. Yeviomi, are you there?
Yes, I'm here.
Selena, you are there?
Yes, ma'am.
And Waheto, I'll call you people to repeat, not just the ones I have mentioned. I will call people randomly to repeat the steps. Number one, ATP, which is already bound to the myosin head, is broken down. When it is broken down, it is broken down to ADP plus inorganic phosphate. But those ones are not released. They are stuck. They are still stuck to the ATP binding site. But because of that hydrolysis, if you remember what I said in class, when we are looking at the table, we said that there is ATPase activity. ATPase breaks this ATP molecule into ADP plus inorganic phosphate. The ATPase enzyme activity is found on the myosin head. So the myosin has ATPase activity, and the ATPase is an enzyme that will break ATP into ADP plus inorganic phosphate. When that happens, the myosin head now has three components. It is stuck with ADP, it is stuck with an inorganic phosphate, and it has a lot of energy. However, if there is no calcium, that is the only thing it can stay with. An energized head with ADP plus inorganic phosphate. It stays like that if we do not have calcium in the cytoplasm. Why? Because without calcium, tropomyosin is covering the active sites on actin molecule. So even if it is energized and it wants to attach, it cannot attach. Now, stimulate that myofibril, cause the release of calcium, which floods the sarcoplasm. Immediately the calcium goes, it will go to the troponin molecule, and the troponin has a calcium binding site. So the calcium will attach to the troponin molecule. It will cause a transformational change which will twist and pull the tropomyosin away from the actin. When that happens, it will expose the active binding sites on the actin molecule. Now remember, my cycle started with a very energized head, with ADP stuck to it, with inorganic phosphate stuck to it. Now, when you expose these active sites, immediately the energized head will attach. The attachment is a cue for the inorganic phosphate to detach. So the inorganic phosphate leaves. And when the inorganic phosphate leaves, it causes a transformational change of the myosin molecule, so that the myosin molecule will bend itself. But as it bends, it is still stuck to actin. Because of that bending, and it is still attached to actin, it will pull the actin in this direction, as the arrow says. When it pulls it, that power stroke of bending will cause the ADP to be released. So now, remember, the myosin head has an ATP binding site. But now that site has released inorganic phosphate and it has released ADP. So what remains on the myosin head is an empty pocket. An empty pocket that can bind ATP. So what happens? The next step will happen. ATP will come from the cytoplasm and attach to that pocket. The minute ATP attaches, it's a cue for the head to detach, to separate from the actin. So ATP from the sarcoplasm will bind, causing the myosin head to separate from the actin filament. The minute they separate, the ATPase activity on the myosin head kicks in. and ATPase will break ATP into ADP plus inorganic phosphates. That breaking will cause this myosin head, remember it was folded. The breaking will cause the myosin head to straighten itself out, and we say it goes into a cocked position. There it is. It straightens out, it cocks itself, ready to repeat the cycle. Now, if the cycle were to repeat, it will attach to the myosin head, it will fold itself, pulling, acting, and then repeating the whole cycle, detaching, causing another active site to come in place, pull it again. So it is a cycle. Nema, your hand is up.
Yes, madam, you were too fast. Quite behind. Like from when the phosphate and the ADP are released. That's why you were somehow fast.
Okay, I was a bit fast. I think I have a summary. The reason you could not follow is because they were in different slides. I think I have a summary slide. So allow me to continue to show you. I think, let me see whether I have it here. Oh, yeah. I will get you a summary slide that puts all those sequences in place. I will use one diagram for the sake of going slowly. Okay, so before I start the cycle, Basil, you have a question. Remember?
Yes, so I just wanted a confirmation.
Yes.
So at the beginning of the cycle, when myosin is tightly bound to actin, there's no adenosine triphosphate bound to myosin.
When myosin binds to actin,
yes.
When the myosin head does not have ATP. It usually has ADP plus inorganic phosphate.
Okay, thank you.
Okay, so this is the start of the cycle. I don't know whether I have another one. This is the start of the cycle. You see this diagram? It is representing what you call a resting sarcomere, where the myosin heads cannot bind to the actin. Why? Because tropomyosin has covered the active sites. Myosin heads cannot bind to the actin filament. First, let's orient ourselves. The pink portions on the actin molecules are inactive sites. The yellow portion are the myosin binding sites. If you understand that, we can move on to the next stage. Myosin binding sites are all covered by tropomyosin. Why? There is no calcium. Okay, there is no calcium, so the tropomyosin covers the active sites. Stimulate that muscle fiber. And what you're going to do is to flood it with calcium. So we have calcium here, we have calcium there. So the calcium that is floating in the sarcoplasm targets one molecule. And the molecule is troponin. Why? Because troponin has a calcium binding site. Nema, are we together up to there? Calcium binding site on troponin. So the calcium binds to troponin. It will cause the troponin to shift, and in the course of shifting, it will pull away the tropomyosin. Anybody lost at that stage? Okay. Upon binding calcium, troponin will pull away the tropomyosin, and when the tropomyosin is shifted, it will leave the yellow portions exposed. The yellow portions are the myosin binding site. So nobody is lost at that stage. I go to step 2. Now, before I go to step 2, I want to alert you that all these myosin heads, they had attached to ATP before, but because we have inbuilt ATPase activity within the myosin head, upon attaching to ATP, the enzyme activity on the head will cleave the ATP into ATP plus inorganic phosphate. And that energy will force the head to straighten out. So now the head is straightened out. It is a magnet ready to bind, but it has nowhere to bind. Anybody lost at that stage? Please let me see your hand. I will go slowly. Okay, so we have energized heads, we have inorganic phosphate, and we have ADP. Bring in calcium. The calcium binds troponin and covers the myosin active sites, or rather the actin active sites, which can bind myosin. And because this is energized, it's like a magnet. Immediately you uncover it, this one binds. Okay? Immediately you uncover, the myosin heads bind. Anybody lost at that stage? Nobody. Remember, I'll call somebody to repeat the cycle. So make sure you are following so that I don't call you. Okay, let me see who I'm going to call. Yeah, I've seen her. Or is it him? It doesn't matter. So now, this is step 2, calcium has bound, and that has happened. The next step, step 3. After they have bound, remember this is the binding now of the straight heads, they have bound. After binding, it is noted that immediately after binding, inorganic phosphate falls off. And it is in that falling off of the inorganic phosphate that this head bends in this direction. You can see the hinge here. It's like a door. It swings this way. This one is like a door. It swings that way. And you can imagine all the heads that are on this line swinging at the same time. What will happen? As they swing, they will pull this whole structure in that direction. And that whole structure is the actin. So it looks like the myosins are walking in that direction and pulling the actin in this direction because of this folding of the heads. The folding is prompted by the release of inorganic phosphate. It causes that what we call a power stroke. It folds. It pulls it. Upon pulling, that change is enough to cause the ADP to fall off. So now you have lost your inorganic phosphate, you have lost your ADP, and your molecule is folded, but still stuck. It's still stuck to the actin. So at this point, we are at this situation. They have dropped ADP plus inorganic phosphates. They are still folded. They have caused the actin to move. But now we have empty pockets on the myosin heads. Who is lost at that stage? You have lost inorganic phosphate, you have lost ADP, You have initiated a power stroke, you have moved the actin, and then you have lost the ADP. You have an empty pocket. That empty pocket has the ability to bind ATP. And remember, we always have ATP in the cytoplasm. So upon ATP binding the empty pocket, it loses the attraction to actin filament. So it's like a love-hate relationship. If you bind ATP, I will leave you. So ATP binds myosin head, and actin decides to leave the myosin head. Who is lost at that stage? Nobody. So let's go to that stage where the ATP binds, and upon binding, it causes the detachment. So the actin will release the myosin because it has attached to ATP. But ATP cannot exist on the myosin head without being broken down, because the myosin head has ATPase activity. It has an enzyme activity, and that enzyme activity is to break down the ATP into ADP plus inorganic phosphate. So the next thing is that enzyme will kick in and break that molecule. Can you see the positioning of the myosin head? It is still folded. It is still folded, but now ATP has attached to it. The next step is when the ATPase breaks down ADP into inorganic phosphates and ADP, that force is enough to cock the head, to straighten the head and pull it outwards. So imagine it had bound to this particular, let me mark, if it had bound to this the active head on the actin, when you cock it, now the one that comes into close vicinity is this other one. Therefore, if the cycle were to repeat, bring in calcium. By the way, the calcium has not detached. Because the calcium has not detached, this place is still exposed. And because it is still exposed, remember the myosin head has the energy from ATP. So the myosin head will attach to the second active site, and the cycle will be repeated, and this actin molecule will be pulled this way, and this particular active site will come to this region, and the head will be cocked, ready to join the next active site. Nema.
Yes, madam.
Now, did you capture the whole steps?
Yes.
So I was slow enough?
Yes.
Brian. Is it Brian? You are also asking a question? You also followed?
Yeah.
There is somebody who raised a question, her hand, or who was that person who wanted to ask something? So do I start calling names? Who wants to repeat the cycle? So we have quite a number of people. Because I had called Brian, let's hear Brian. Brian, start off, and halfway I'll stop you so that Lavi can continue. And when you're halfway, I'll stop you so that Priska can continue. So Brian, let's start.
The first thing is that the ATP is hydrolyzed into ADP and phosphate, inorganic phosphate, and energy. Now this there is release of energy, which goes into the myosin head, making it highly energized, and it will act like a magnet ready to bind to the active sites. But the active sites
Okay,
are still not.
Stop. Rutendo. Continue. Rutendo, unmute yourself.
Okay.
Start from where Brian has reached.
All right. So as Brian was saying that the okay. So when the myosin binding sites are exposed, because the myosin heads are very active and are ready to bind, they immediately bind to the exposed myosin binding sites. And when they bind, this is because the calcium, and when they bind, they release inorganic potassium. And then once inorganic potassium is released, ADP is also released. This causes what we call a stroke, an energy stroke. And because of this energy stroke, the myosin head bends and causes the actin molecule to move towards, and hence that is why we have the movement of the actin heads towards the H band when during contraction.
Okay,
And
stop. There are 2 points of correction, and I need somebody willing to help the correction, but Priska will take over from where she has reached. 2 points of correction. Priska, you want to do the correction or to continue?
I can try to correct.
Yes.
What she said, after the release of inorganic phosphate, the release of inorganic phosphate is the one which caused the power stroke.
Okay, hold on. Sandra, you had raised your hand.
It's okay. I just wanted to correct her, but Priska already started.
Yeah, what did you want to correct? That's why I stopped Priska.
Oh no, there was the part in which she said that potassium is released. It's not potassium, that's phosphate.
Yes.
And
I
then
realized
there's another thing.
Okay, go ahead. Go ahead.
Oh, then there was another part she was saying myosin binds to myosin sites. I don't know. I got like a little bit mixed up there.
Okay, so it was nice, but she was mixing some terminologies. It is not potassium, it is phosphate. That was the one thing that I picked. And number 2, we talk of the power stroke. She mentioned something to do with the power something, but it's the simple terminology, you call it a power stroke, and the power stroke is due to the release of the inorganic phosphate, not potassium. So from there, I think Priska was already explaining what happens next.
So after that, there's also release of ADP. And then after the release of ADP, the ATP comes and binds to the empty pocket of the myosin head, causing it to separate from the actin.
Okay, stop there so that Adrian can take over. So now it has separated from the actin. Adrian, tell us what happened next.
After it was separated from the actin,
You are muted, Adrian.
the head straightens. The myosin head straightens.
No, before the head straightens, there is something that happens. Mustafa, what causes the head to straighten? Adrian is right, it will straighten, but not before something has happened. Amatullah, What will cause the myosin head to straighten? Mustafa, are you there? Remember, if you don't answer, I mark you absent.
The ATP is converted to an inorganic phosphate.
Thank you. The breaking of ATP produces energy, and that energy is the one that pops the head open. So after that happens, now you are back to the initial position and you are ready to start the cycle. Make sure that you follow those steps one by one, and you will be able. If you can follow the steps, you can understand that contraction mechanism. That mechanism is known as the sliding filament mechanism. So I have brought in power stroke, I have brought in sliding filament, I have brought in cocking of the head. So all those things you need to understand where they fall into place. So now, I wanted to show you these steps. So remember, this diagram is the one we started, showing you the myosin molecule. They call it a complex because it has several chains. We have the heavy chains, the neck region, we have the hinge, we have the light chains, we have the ATPase. Remember, ATPase activity is simply this myosin binds itself, it coils itself in such a way it has pockets for holding substrates. And when they are together, it causes the substrate to split into the products. So it's not another protein that is attached to the head. Instead, it is the head that has activity that will enable it to act like an enzyme. That's why we say it has ATPase activity. That ATP binds the myosin head. Upon binding, the ATPase will cause the cleaving so that you separate it into ADP plus inorganic phosphate. And that cleaving causes the straightening of the head. So you can see this one cocked, this one is bent, and this one is straightened, ready to attach. So now, the other thing I need you to keep in mind, the calcium appears as yellow. That ATPase activity is usually stimulated by attachment of magnesium. So if we don't have magnesium, you find it will not cleave the ATP because the activity is stimulated by attachment of magnesium. So we have to follow the cycle. Calcium attaches. After calcium attaches, tropomyosin is moved. After tropomyosin is moved, active sites are exposed, causing immediate attachment. And upon attachment of this one, it will cause a power stroke, which will release ADP plus inorganic phosphate, leaving an empty pocket, magnesium ATP attaching to the empty pocket, magnesium activating ATPase cleaving the two, and it's a cycle. So this diagram next, the next diagram here will actually show you the steps opening, and I will advise you on how to watch this movie. If you want to see the effect of troponin, blind your eyes to everything else and focus only on troponin. Do that for several cycles and see what the troponin is doing. Then focus your eyes on tropomyosin. I will allow several cycles to happen. Then tropomyosin, you'll see the way it keeps on twisting and going back. Focus your head on the myosin head. See what is happening on the myosin head. You are going to see ATP come to the head, attach, followed by magnesium, come to the head, Attach followed by the cleaving. The cleaving will release ADP plus PI, but still stuck, and then the cycle continues. So every time you want to see the events happening, focus your eyes on only one item. If you try to look at all the steps, then you'll be lost. There you are. So let's focus on troponin. Troponin has no calcium. Calcium is yellow, binds troponin, it twists the whole tropomyosin, and upon twisting, it exposes the myosin binding sites. Upon exposure, myosin binds. Upon binding, ATP binds. After ATP binds, magnesium binds. Magnesium causes the splitting of ATP. Upon attaching, inorganic phosphate followed by ADP bind release. So you can actually follow one at a time, and you'll see all the steps that we have mentioned. That is the mechanism of muscle contraction. Any questions so far? So as you can see, this is a cut section of a myofibril. Remember, a myofibril comprises of myofilaments. Myofilaments are mainly the actin and myosin. So if I cut a cross section, remember that diagram where we were cutting at various stages? So if I were to cut through this section, I will cut through a section of the sarcoplasm, sarcoplasmic reticulum. And this is the tubular structure of the sarcoplasmic reticulum, having a lot of calcium inside. So whenever you stimulate, you're going to open calcium channels, and the calcium channels will flood all over the sarcoplasm. And they will go to the troponin. Remember, at this portion, I have some actin sections that have been cut by a cross section. So if I cut through the actin filament, I'm going to cut through the globular actin with the nebulin holding the two globular actins together. Covering the myosin binding site is the tropomyosin molecule, which has been cut by cross section here. And this tropomyosin is interacting with the troponin. So now in the second step, calcium binds and pulls the tropomyosin away. You can see here, upon pulling it away, it leaves this place exposed. And remember, this was this difference, the six, are they six or are they seven? Myosin with the myosin heads here. The myosins are dropping down. So the myosins are activated, and when this part is released, they attach. Now you can see we have the myosin on this side and we have the myosins on this side. Upon attaching, they form a bridge between the actin and the myosin. So there is that bridge formation. That is what we call the cross bridge formation. And it only forms when the myosin attaches to actin. And I think I will stop at that. I said I promised to keep it until 12. Okay. I promised to keep it until 12. So, and I have finished what I wanted to do, which is the cycle. Please follow up on the cycles. Be able to follow them up. Number 2, the next step that we are going to learn is the neuromuscular junction, but we did this in the other physiology. Remember 13, 31, we did the neuromuscular junction. I am not going to go through that again. I will leave you with an assignment to look at the neuromuscular junction. The next step we are going to do is called excitation contraction coupling. That is where I'll take it over from. So I will not look at the neuromuscular junction. That is the assignment to go and review. And then I will start on the coupling. Okay, and I think that's where I'll end. This is the step where I will come in. Excitation, contraction, coupling. So please go and look at the neuromuscular junction. So at this point, I will take attendance. I will call the name